So for this case study, I'm talking to Chris Paling, Senior Lecturer at MMU. So Chris, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and say kind of what work you do.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. So when I originally left education and university, I started work at Manchester Airport as an environment advisor. And then I came back to education and academia about 9 years ago when I came to MMU as a researcher for a few years and then a lecturer. And so I continue to spend quite a bit of my time working with the aviation industry, largely to deal with the climate change challenge. And I also do teaching as well on principally environmental science and some geography programs.
So you work in Manchester, and do you feel that Manchester is a very sustainable city?
No, I don't think Manchester is anywhere near a sustainable city. And that doesn't make it unique. I don't think there's a sustainable city in the world. Obviously, it depends how you define sustainability. But if we look at the sort of social and environmental aspects of sustainability, then you can't truly say any city in the world, I think, is sustainable. But there are some that are closer to that than others. And Manchester has some real strengths and is showing leadership in some areas. It probably lags behind other cities in other areas. So, you know, it has a mixed bag there of strengths and areas to improve on. But no, I don't think you could possibly say it's sustainable. And that's principally because there are greenhouse gas emissions from the city. There are air pollution issues. And then in terms of the circular economy, there, you know, we do still use resources in Manchester, and we don't reuse or recycle as everything that we should or could or should do. So it's not to say you know Manchester is any more or less sustainable than anywhere else. You know, this is a difficult judgment to make, but I don't think you could actually say it's sustainable. And I think if you think of some of that's the sort of environmental side. If you think of the social side, you know, there's probably enough wealth in Manchester for everyone to live a decent life and be happy, but that's not equally shared by everyone. There are some people who have more money than perhaps they need to be happy, and there are certainly people in society who don't have enough money. And again, it's about having access to fulfilling careers and jobs as well. So there's plenty of work still to be done. So it's not all bad news, but no, I don't think you could say it's sustainable.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's interesting, and something I've found talking to a few people is kind of how we define sustainability and how we look at a city like Manchester. Do we look at its problems and things to fix, or do we look at its strengths and try and build on them? So I think, yeah, maybe that is quite a broad question, but thanks for the answer.
Yeah, it is. It's about, you know, what does a sustainable city look like? Just like what does sustainability look like at the global level or at an organization or company level? These definitions are a little bit vague, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It's good because it allows them to be flexible, but it's a bad thing in terms of then it's difficult to say if something is actually sustainable or not.
Yeah, definitely, I think.
Okay.
So how does your work contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
So I guess principally for me, it's probably, and I have to remind myself which are numbered which. So I guess for me, it's principally climate action is where my work is focused, because although I teach a broad range of sustainability issues, my research and advisory work is focused on climate change and aviation. So I would be in climate action, but these things aren't in silos, are they? So, you know, there's also impacts in terms of affordable and clean energy, which is SDG 7. And then, you know, 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. And also, particularly with the work with the aviation sector, in SDG 9, which is industry innovation and infrastructure. So, and I guess, my work is focused around airports and aviation. So Manchester has a big airport, one of the busiest outside, well, the busiest outside London in the UK. So that's an important part of Manchester's economy and gives people access to route networks around the world, whether it's to visit friends and family, to holiday, or for business. And so, and lots of people within Manchester do choose to fly, sometimes once a year for a holiday, or sometimes for other reasons.
Okay, great. You might have already just touched on this, but could you provide a quick outline of kind of the work you do towards reaching the Sustainable Development Goals in Manchester?
So, having touched on it a bit before, I work a lot with airports. Airports are a source of greenhouse gas emissions themselves, but from the sector as a whole, the main source of emissions is people's flights. So the work I do tends to look at how can we actually decarbonize aviation. So what can we do to decarbonize airports, how people get to and from the airport, for example, work by bus or train or get driven there, and then the flights themselves. And I guess my particular niche and the work I do is focused on robust and comprehensive carbon accounting. So it's very important when we look at how to deal with these sectors, whether it's cities or their airports or their residents' flights, how do we account for those emissions? So if you take Manchester Airport, there are people who use Manchester Airport who don't live in Manchester or Greater Manchester. They'll come from Yorkshire, or they'll come from Merseyside, or even Scotland. They'll come from further afield. So how do you account for this? And that's important when it comes to policy setting and reducing emissions as well, as to which emissions are you focusing on and how are you going to do that. So I guess my particular niche is that accounting, which informs management strategies, mitigation strategies, and policy setting.
I think that's really interesting, because one thing, so in the module we've looked at kind of past efforts towards sustainability over the last few decades. And I think one issue that's come up has been how we track them and how we identify actions. So I think kind of identifying and tracking our emissions is really important, and maybe something that hasn't been as rigorously applied in the past as it could have been.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And one specific example is what we call sustainable aviation fuels. So in terms of our flying, one of the ways to decarbonize is to use alternatives to fossil fuel kerosene. So we can make fuels out of sort of waste cooking oil or crops that we grow in the fields. So we can fly aircraft on these fuels. That's been done. That's safe and proven. The challenge now is to make these sufficiently available to make an actual real impact in terms of decarbonizing aviation, and also to ensure that these fuels are sort of sustainable, so they don't impact on land use, they don't increase water consumption, they don't affect people's sort of indigenous rights to land, in other parts of the world, and they don't lead to deforestation. So, this brings in a whole raft of other sustainability criteria. And that's where the robust accounting is important as well for greenhouse gas emissions, because we don't want to be turned into a different fuel that, when you look across its whole life cycle in terms of growing the crop, using fertilizer and so on, actually doesn't really reduce emissions at all. And that's possible. So that's why we need these robust accounting methods.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really nice example of kind of an approach of progress towards one goal, but how you have to kind of keep them all in mind. I think you touched on all of those there, that
yes.
Sourcing those fuels really does touch all the other goals. So I think that's a nice example there.
It makes the job a difficult and sometimes confusing one, but we've got to make sure we do it properly.
Yeah. And so again, maybe you've already touched on this, but what are some of the greatest challenges, do you think, in taking climate action or the other SDGs within Manchester?
Yeah, I think to me, and particularly when we think about, I mean, I'm thinking at the moment about SDGs around sort of responsible consumption and production, so circular economy and greenhouse gas emissions. So some of the key environmental sustainability issues. And I think that the biggest challenge is bringing about change. We know a lot of the solutions, but it's actually making it happen. And that's going to require change within Manchester by Manchester residents at an individual level. So we'll need behaviour change, and then we'll also need systemic change as well. So we'll need change, at the sort of authority levels and organisational levels. And I think making that change happen is going to be a real challenge. Now, I think previously people haven't made the change required because they've perhaps not felt the emergency that climate change is. And now we're starting to see that. We're also starting to see, I think, with the circular economy and a lot of issues around plastics in the oceans, in our rivers, getting deposited on land, so we're starting to see that these are, becoming more urgent issues. So I do think we might see change coming a bit quicker in the future. But it hasn't been quick enough, and I think that's the real challenge at a city level. And I think one of the other issues for cities like Manchester is it doesn't sit in isolation. So it's part of the UK, so a lot of policy setting and funding and taxation is done at the national level, not at the city level. And then also a lot happens at an international level. And particularly when you think of the sector I'm most familiar with, aviation, most of that happens at an international level because most of the flying is done internationally, not nationally. So that means Manchester has a challenge in trying to push ahead of everyone else, because it's going to be sort of constrained by national and international sort of policy frameworks and taxation and market measures.
Yeah, I think, and again, thanks for bringing it up. I like that idea that we can start at the local level with looking at maybe like transport to and from the airport, but that gradually grows up until we've got this international efforts to kind of reduce the emissions of aviation travel. Because that was kind of one of the points of talking to people, was to kind of show that even starting at the very ground level in your local community, it does escalate things up to a global scale quite quickly.
Yes. I think we need both. I think we need very much that bottom-up individual and community action, but we also need the top-down as well. So I think, what can an individual in Manchester do? Well, there's a lot they can do in terms of their own lifestyle and behaviours. But one of the things they can also do is write to their local MP, to put that pressure on MPs, to make sure action is being taken at a government level.
Yeah, thanks. I think some of those tips as well of how we can get involved is really useful as well. And so just to wrap up, I think one thing I've been trying to do throughout this module is kind of show where positive action has brought about change, and not always focus on the doom and gloom, which you can get into with a sustainability.
Yes.
And I think you've talked about that through some of these answers, which have been really good. But could you just share a recent success story in bringing the SDGs to Manchester? Or
yeah, I think, and it's very much focused on what I do, so very specific to my area of work. So as well as doing the research that underpins, or we hope underpins, a lot of the decision making that's taken at the city level or national level, I come back to that sort of accounting, and one of the projects I was involved in recently, and it was working with other universities in Greater Manchester and other agencies as well, including the local authorities and some consultants, was we actually produced the city level carbon footprint, and within that we actually did a calculation for the flights from people within the region, so within Manchester, and also for the airport as well, bearing in mind not everyone who flies from Manchester is flying from Manchester or is flying to Manchester. They might fly to the airport and then head off to somewhere else. So we did all those calculations, and the methodologies to do this are still really developing. So it very much was, you know, a sort of let's have a go at this and do the best job we possibly can. So we, you know, and since then other cities have looked to how Manchester has gone about doing that that footprint for the city and for its aviation emissions. So I think, you know, that was a piece of work that might not directly actually reduce emissions, but it provides the information that people can then make decisions on to actually bring about reductions. And one of the things the city has done since those calculations were made is it's developed a carbon budget aligned to the Paris Agreement as to how many more emissions can come from flights from Manchester residents, you know, if we are to meet that 1.5 degrees temperature increase, if we are to keep below that. So, you know, we were able to produce the data to actually allow that calculation to be made. But one of the challenges there, maybe just to sort of come back to one of the challenges, you know, cities do face in isolation is, you know, if you set a budget for Manchester Airport, then what's to stop people then using another airport? So this is why it does require action, and not just at the city level, but at the national and international level.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really nice example. And you also touched on the goal that's just over my shoulder, that the partnership for the goals. And I think that's really fun. And you've highlighted how a single action or something, one case study really can be shared, and that sharing ideas and collaborating, I think, is really important as well to bring about the SDGs. And like you said, making sure that we're not cutting emissions somewhere and just moving them somewhere else, I think is really important.
Yes, that's right. And you know, there's a real danger that can happen. So, you know, despite everyone's best efforts, you find you've not actually reduced emissions, and it's really important that they are actually reduced. And so, you know, I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and you're right, there's a lot of partnership working to be done here. And that is difficult. It is a challenge, but I think we're working increasingly now under this awareness that climate change is happening. So I think that is galvanizing people to work more collaboratively and to actually try and make meaningful reductions in emissions.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Chris. That was really useful. I think you provided some really nice case studies and examples of how we research and steps towards things can become those much bigger issues.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, if people want to just reflect on this, you know, it's not to say don't fly. I'm sure there'll still be some flying in the future in a net zero carbon world, but I think, you know, just treat flying and the emissions that come from flying as sort of a precious resource, and think very carefully about why you're flying and whether it's necessary. So it's not to feel guilty about flying if you only fly once a year and you don't go too far. But if you're going to go to Australia, I would say don't do it every year. You know, think about if you could even afford to do it every year. And perhaps many of us couldn't. But
I think it's maybe one positive, if we try and find some positives in the recent pandemic, is maybe people will consider the necessary flying more.
I think you're right. Yes, I think people are. Yeah, and I think that's certainly true for businesses. I think they're certainly seeing now everyone's much more aware of the technology and they've been pushed into using it. I think the industry itself, the aviation industry, accepts this, that, you know, there'll be less business flying in the future, certainly for the foreseeable future, because it's a cost in terms of money and also time.